It is very early in the morning. The kind of early that isn't brave or productive, it's just damp. Cobblestones glisten under last night's rain, and chimneys puff out slow streams of white that tangle in the rooftops like lazy ghosts. You walk slowly, boots scuffing, along the edge of the Rue Saint-Antoine. It smells like onions, ash, and something vaguely rodent-like. No one comments on the last part. In this neighborhood, that smell just means the day has started. A cart creaks past, pulled by a grey mule that looks like it's been working since the Crusades. The cart is full of turnips and a single large cat. The cat blinks at you once, judgmentally, then goes back to sleep. You're not a merchant, you're not a priest, you're not even here to buy anything. You're just watching, quietly, as the city wakes, or stretches, or grimaces. This is Paris in the mid-1300s. And while you might expect churches and kings and the smell of fresh bread, today's story comes from a different part of the city. One that lives lower to the ground, one that listens for rustling. You're standing near the edge of what was once a monastery garden. Now, it's something else. The soil has long since dried up. The herbs are gone. What remains is a muddy courtyard, a half-smashed barrel, and a man standing next to a pile of rats. Yes, rats. And no, they're not there by accident. You may want to adjust your blanket or dim your light a little more, because this story starts off soft but ends with a sigh. And before we go further, if you like quiet history like this, gently told, never rushed, subscribe, leave a comment with your location and local time, and click the like button if this helps you fall asleep. It truly helps. Now let's ease into the muddy side streets of 14th first century Paris, where one man, a man with a bag of chalk, a ferret and a stick, was treated like a folk hero. At least until the wind changed. You walk past a tavern called Le Cocon Cuirit, the Laughing Pig. Someone scrawled a rat underneath the sign in charcoal. Not for decoration, it's a kind of code. Inside, the tavern keeper is already awake, pouring vinegar across the threshold and muttering something about biters. You don't ask. Further down the alley, you spot him. A short man, broad-shouldered, boots caked with mud, carrying a sack that moves ever so slightly. He whistles a little tune, a tune that sounds like something between a lullaby and a war cry. That's your man, the ratier, the rat catcher. Historical fact: by the mid-14th first century, Paris had dozens of officially recognized rat catchers, some working under guilds, others as independent contractors. Their job wasn't just to kill rats. They were part exterminator, part local legend, part plague prevention force, part cautionary tale. Many carried pouches of chalk to mark problem walls, used trained animals, and even wore specific colors to distinguish themselves from thieves. Some, like our friend today, also wore a brass token stamped with the city's seal, proving they had permission to carry out their work, which sounds a little dramatic, until you realize rats had literally shut down parts of the city just a few years earlier. Cultural tidbit: in some quarters of Paris, children used to leave tiny balls of dough or bits of garlic outside their doors on the eve of St. Gertrude's Day. She was the patron saint of travelers and also of those hoping to keep rats away. Some families swore by cloves rubbed into the window frames. Others kept tame cats not for catching rats, but for intimidating them spiritually. As for the rat catchers, they were said to smell like vinegar and victory, and sometimes onions. You follow the rat catcher a bit longer. He stops at a doorway and kneels. Out comes the ferret. It disappears under a pile of wood. He waits, then a squeak, a rustle, a triumphant tug. He doesn't cheer, just nods once, then drops the rat in the sack and moves on. You wonder how many he'll catch before the sun rises fully. and whether anyone will thank him. He doesn't expect it, but sometimes the bakers leave him a roll, soft, slightly stale, still warm, not heroic, just enough. The daily rhythm of a ratier, unspoken city respect, and quiet symbols of power, you trail behind him for a while, keeping to the edge of puddles and downwind of his sack, which now moves faintly like a grain sack filled with breath. He doesn't seem to mind your company. He's seen stranger things in alleyways. At one point, he offers you a bit of hard cheese from his pocket. It's shaped like a triangle, but definitely not on purpose. You decline politely. He nods, understanding, then eats it himself with no expression whatsoever. You are deeply unsure whether this counts as breakfast. The man doesn't talk much, but he whistles, always in pieces, 4 or 5 notes, repeated in patterns. Not songs, exactly, more like codes. You ask if the tunes mean anything. He shrugs, sometimes. That's either very helpful or not at all. He stops at a bakery next, presses 2 fingers to the doorframe, then leans down and draws a chalk spiral with a dot in the center. This time he adds a second mark, a horizontal slash just below it. You glance at him. 4 he says, 1 bold. Inside, the baker nods once, from behind a rack of loaves, doesn't speak, doesn't stop kneading, but he moves the top basket off the shelf, just in case. There's a strange kind of intimacy in the exchange, the kind that comes not from friendship, but from mutual understanding. You don't need to like someone to respect their warning. In a city that runs on bread, the presence of rats isn't just unhygienic, it's existential. In plague years, a spoiled flour sack could collapse a street's worth of kitchens. A sick baker could poison a parish. The rat catcher, oddly enough, is the first line of defense, before the priests, before the doctors, before the guards. He never says that out loud. He doesn't have to. The 2 of you continue toward the spice quarter, where the stones shift from grey to rose-colored underfoot, and the air smells like cinnamon, ginger, and old coins. A group of boys runs past, shouting something about bones. One of them stops to look at the ratier's sack, then thinks better of it and runs after the others. A woman selling cloves nods toward a barrel, heard scratching last night. The rat catcher tilts his head. 1, 2, maybe 3, she says. He doesn't answer, just drops a pinch of salt from his pocket near the edge of the barrel, then marks the wall beside it with 2 chalk X's and a dot. You're beginning to notice a pattern. Every mark is a message, a private ledger, written in public, invisible to everyone but the people who need to read it. A rat appears, not scurrying, just standing. On the sill of a spice shop, between a jar of mustard seeds and a display of dried figs. It doesn't move when the rat catcher looks at it. It just stares. You stare too. Eventually it blinks, then it's gone. The ratier doesn't move, just says, softly, "That one's thinking." You ask if that's a bad sign. He squints, only if it comes back. You start to ask what he means, but he's already moving again, muttering to himself. You catch a few words. Line, brick, rosemary, jawbone. You wonder if it's a curse, a recipe, or both. Historical fact in Plague-era Paris. Rat catchers became strangely essential to the functioning of urban life. While they weren't part of the church or noble class, they were given certain exemptions, allowed to cross boundaries, mark buildings, and speak to merchants and clergy without formal titles. Some wore city-issued brass badges, stamped with a symbol resembling a rat and a wheel, indicating both pest and rotation, a cycle that never ends. Others were issued distinctive cloaks, dyed with onion peel or walnut husks to make them easier to spot and avoid. According to the 1349 Paris civic rolls, rat catchers were paid more than stonemasons in certain seasons, especially in areas near bakeries and monasteries, where infestation was considered spiritually dangerous. Some were even given limited access to city records and maps, as they knew the flow of sewer tunnels better than most engineers. Not bad for a man with a stick and a whistle. The ratier sits briefly near the fishmonger's stalls. The smell is a little overwhelming. Fish oil, blood, vinegar, and that sharp sour note that only comes from pickled eel. He tears a piece of stale bread from his satchel, offers you some. You take it this time. It's not good, but it is warm. Nearby, a woman drops a sack of potatoes and says, "They're back under the barrel again." The ratier nods, finishes chewing, doesn't get up right away. It's not that he's lazy, it's that he knows exactly how long he has before they scatter. Timing matters. You walk again, this time through a quieter lane, where the buildings lean inward as though conspiring. Ivy curls along cracked shutters. A pale cat watches from a windowsill, tail twitching like a metronome. The ratier pauses in front of a stone arch. Carved above it are the faded remains of a face, some saint or scholar whose name no one remembers. The ratier taps the base of the arch 3 times with his boot. You ask why. He says, "Habit." You don't question it. Cultural tidbit: in some quarters, rat catchers weren't feared or mocked. They were admired, even seen as luck bringers. It was believed that speaking to one on a Friday morning would ward off illness, especially if you offered him vinegar or onions. In some bakeries, the first loaf of the day, called le pain de ratier, was kept aside for whichever catcher passed through first. He rarely asked for it, it was just given. It's not that they were heroes, but they were necessary. And in a city as unpredictable as Paris, necessity often looked a lot like holiness. Eventually you reach a square with a fountain that doesn't quite work. The water dribbles down one side like it's changed its mind halfway through. The ratier sits on the edge of the stone basin and removes one boot. A walnut falls out. You don't ask. Instead you sit beside him. There's a kind of quiet here that doesn't ask questions. It just listens. The kind of quiet that belongs to people who see things before everyone else does and don't need applause for it. You watch as he reaches into his coat and pulls out a tiny bone charm. It's carved with a spiral. No words, just the shape. He drops it in the fountain. The splash is barely audible. Then he says, "One more block, then lunch, then more rats." You walk beside him. You've stopped worrying about why. The city still moves around you. Bells, carts, children, cats. But in the space just behind all that, there's something else moving too. Something smaller, faster. And he hears it before anyone else does. The city may not say thank you, but it notices. And sometimes it leaves a roll on the doorstep. Still warm. Still enough. The ratier's tools, the markets he watches, and the language of vermin, you don't know when you started walking in step with him. It wasn't a decision, more like an accident of rhythm. You on the left, slightly behind. Him on the right, sack swaying gently, boots tapping out a pattern you can't quite follow. There's a cadence to his movements. Not hurried, not casual, something in between. Like someone who knows that haste scares the rats, but so does stillness. The key, it seems, is to move like you're not worth noticing. He stops beside a merchant selling boiled beets. The vendor nods, lifts a plank near the back of his cart, underneath a neat pile of gnawed scraps. The ratier peers in, pulls out a stick of chalk, and scribbles something on the rim of the cart. A quick spiral, then 2 vertical lines. You lean over. That means what, you ask? Watch the drain, he replies. They're listening through the water. You don't ask how he knows. At this point, it would feel rude. He carries a few tools, not many, a coil of soft twine, a pouch of salt and rosemary, 2 strips of cured pork, you hope they're pork for baiting, a wooden whistle worn smooth from use. You've yet to hear him blow it. He says it's not for rats. It's for calling back ferrets that get lost in walls. And then there's the stick, not a weapon, not a staff, just a carved rod of ashwood, about as long as his forearm. The end is wrapped in cloth and tar, hardened like a club. He calls it leifin, the end. You ask if he always names his sticks. He says, only the ones that remember. You try not to overthink that sentence. You pass through the Rue de Tanneurs, where leather workers splash water across the cobbles to keep the smell down. Even the rats avoid this street when they can. The ratier pauses anyway, crouching beside a storm grate, eyes scanning the runnels where red-tinted water swirls. He drops a small bundle of mint and crushed garlic near the edge. You raise an eyebrow. Signal, he says, to the rats. No, to the ones who follow them. You decide not to unpack that either. Historical fact: rat catchers in 14th century Paris often developed personal toolkits that reflected their neighborhood and methods. Some used trained dogs, others whistles, and still others, most famously ferrets, that slipped into burrows and dragged rats out by the tail. Guild records from 1358 include mentions of claw gloves, made of boiled leather for clawing under carts, and several rat catchers were noted for wearing iron-lined boots in basements. One particularly inventive ratier designed a rat sack lined with thin netting so he could count live rats by feel, then release them elsewhere for a second payment. City officials were not amused. The ratier stops suddenly and pulls something from his coat. It's a bell, small, brass, dented. He hands it to you, doesn't explain. Then he begins whistling, not a tune this time, but a pattern. 3 quick bursts, pause, 2 longer ones. Somewhere nearby in the shadows, something shifts. Then a long, sleek ferret slinks into view, a tiny bone charm tied around its neck with red thread. It scampers past you and vanishes into a wall. The ratier takes the bell back. Won't be long, he says. You ask what happens if it doesn't return. He shrugs. Then I use leifin. You clutch your cloak a little tighter. Cultural tidbit: in the wealthier quarters of Paris, it was once common to hire a rat porter, a boy who followed the rat catcher carrying a lantern and a tin whistle. Some were apprentices, others were just quick-footed children promised a roll and a coin if they didn't faint. They wore no shoes, so they could feel the rats beneath the floorboards. Some say the best ones could tell how many rats were below just by listening with their toes. Historians still argue whether this is true, but several rat catchers swore by it, and more than one boy became rich doing just that. The ferret returns, carrying a tail in its mouth. Not a full rat, just the back end. The ratier nods. Got him good. Bit early though. He tucks the tail into a cloth pouch, muttering something about tokens. Then he stands, brushes off his coat, and walks on. You walk with him. The city doesn't feel quieter exactly, but it does feel like someone's paying attention. And maybe that's the same thing. Night approaches. Stories gather. Not every rat is meant to be caught. It's nearing dusk. You've spent a full day walking beside a man who carries death in a bag and whistles like he's chasing birds. Your feet hurt. You're hungry. And there are chalk marks in places you don't remember passing, but you don't want to stop. The streets are beginning to change again. Less bustle, more hush. Doors close faster. People move in pairs. A fishmonger tosses out her last stock before the smell turns. The ratier stops by a boarded-up fountain and sits. You sit too. He pulls a folded cloth from his bag. Inside, a small wheel of hard cheese, 3 dried plums, and a lump of bread that looks like it lost a fist fight. He tears the bread in half and hands you the bigger piece. You're too tired to argue. As you eat, he tells you a story. There was one, he begins, fat as a cat, bold as a monk, used to live in the baker's chimney. You raise your eyebrows. No one could get him, he continues. I tried 3 ferrets, 2 sticks, chalk, salt, even the priest's bell. Nothing. You ask how it ended. He sighs. One day he was gone. You ask if someone got him. He shakes his head. No, just left. You both sit in silence. Then he adds, some rats know when their legend's about to end. You ask if that happens to people too. He doesn't answer. Historical fact, some 14th century rat catchers in France became local celebrities, especially if they had high tail counts or used strange methods. One man named Pierre of Bourg-la-Reine carried a wooden flute said to lull rats to sleep, though it probably just startled them long enough for the ferret to bite. In rare cases, rat catchers were given free meals at taverns, their drinks paid by grateful bakers or monks. Some were even invited to bless storerooms with salt and vinegar for good fortune, but fame came with risk. At least 2 catchers were accused of breeding rats in secret to guarantee their own income. Historians still debate whether this was true or simply envy. As the sun lowers, shadows stretch across the cobbles like spilled ink. You ask him what happens at night. He shrugs. Different rats, he says. You ask if they're harder to catch. No, he says. Just harder to trust. Cultural tidbit. There's an old saying in Paris, now mostly forgotten. If you hear footsteps behind the walls, light a candle. If the candle flickers, thank a rat. If it goes out, don't sleep there again. It wasn't just about pests. It was about what the rats were running from. You follow him back toward the inn. He doesn't go in. He just walks to the alley behind it, taps the wall 3 times, and disappears down a side street. You never see him enter a house, but the chalk mark appears by morning, a spiral and a dot, right beside your door. Midnight memories, the city's forgotten edges, and rats that warn before they bite. It's well past midnight, though the bells haven't rung in hours. Either someone forgot, or the bell rope finally gave out. You wonder if rats chew through rope like that. You wouldn't be surprised. You've stopped being surprised by a lot of things. You wake to find the chalk spiral near your door. Still crisp, still marked, still faintly glowing in the light of the inn's crooked hallway candle. You don't remember hearing it drawn. Which means he was careful, or maybe the rats were louder. You throw your cloak around your shoulders and step outside, not because you're brave, but because you've learned that the quietest hours tell the most honest stories. The streets are cold and still damp. Fog hugs the bottom of the door frames. You pass a cat cleaning its paws on a cartwheel. It glances up at you once, disinterested. You wonder if it belongs to anyone, or if it just follows the scent of warmth and fish oil like everyone else. Ahead of you, a faint sound, a whistle low and quick, 3 short bursts, then silence. Then again, you follow it. The alley it leads you to isn't listed on any map, not officially. It's one of those in-between places, a between two walls kind of lane that isn't meant to be found unless you're looking for something you don't want to admit to. The walls here lean more than usual. A sign hangs upside down above a door that's never opened, and at the end of the lane, standing as though summoned from fog, is the ratier. He doesn't greet you, he just gestures to a doorway, then disappears behind it. You follow. Inside is not what you expect. No rats, no stink, no cages or traps, just shelves, stacked with parchment, bundles of rope, empty bottles, a row of gloves stitched with thick seams, and above it all, hanging on the far wall, a dozen rat tails tied in neat bows. You look closer. They're labelled, in charcoal with names. One reads The Librarian, another Gate Chewer, a third simply Midnight. You ask if he names them all. No, he says, just the ones who make me change my route. He pours 2 cups of something hot, not wine, not broth, not tea, exactly. Smells like boiled thyme and vinegar. You drink it anyway. It burns a little. He asks if you've noticed yet. You tilt your head. The rats, he says. They warn before they bite. You frown. He leans forward. If you watch, he continues, they'll scratch first, or freeze, or make a sound. Then he adds, people do that too. You don't reply. You just sip, and watch the steam curl between the hanging tails. Historical fact, some rat catchers in medieval France recorded detailed observations of rat behavior, many of which predated formal studies by centuries. They noted patterns like nesting in warmer corners before plague outbreaks and avoiding salted grain in unusually silent seasons. A few kept private journals, sometimes called charnets, documenting specific rats by street size and behavior. Most were lost to fire, flood, or time, but fragments survive, parchments describing bold rats, the mourners, and even long-whiskered listeners. These weren't jokes, they were field notes. One entry from 1362 reads, Rue Coquillière, 6 tails, 4 bold, 1 watched me while I counted. He stands now, stretches. You ask what's next. He points to a wall map, hand-drawn, fraying, stitched together from scraps. Tiny red X's mark corners, drains, doorsteps. Some are fresh, others faded. He hands you a piece of chalk. Pick one. You hesitate. He shrugs. They'll be there either way, so you choose. A faded mark near the grain warehouse. He nods. Good spot. Then pulls out a pouch. Inside rosemary, salt, a cloth charm, and a twist of old leather. He ties the charm to your belt. Doesn't explain. You don't ask. you're learning. As you both step back into the cold night, the city feels different, not safer, but less alone, because now you know what to look for, not the rats themselves, always, but the signs, and the silences, and the moments that scratch before they bite. Back alley rituals, warnings in flower, and the price of being listened to, the street near the grain house is quieter than the others. Not empty, just still in a different way. There's no fog here, no chimneys, just crates stacked too high and shadows that behave like they've agreed not to move unless asked. The ratier doesn't knock. He just walks into the building like he's always had the right. Inside, barrels, sacks, a wheelbarrow that's been turned into a seat. A candle flickers in a glass jar on the floor, throwing warped shadows onto the grain-covered walls. He kneels, touches the flour dust with 2 fingers, then presses them to the wooden frame of the door. You watch a thin rat dart past your boot. The ratier doesn't chase it. He whispers something you can't hear and begins arranging the salt in a circle. There is no trap, there is no bait, just ritual and stillness. And you, standing there with a belt charm and a growing sense that this work is more sacred than anyone admits. He begins marking the floor with chalk, 3 lines, then a spiral, then a small X above the spiral's center, then nothing for a moment. Then he says, "This was a bakery once." You nod, unsure what he wants from that. He adds, "The rats remember the warmth." And suddenly, that explains everything. You hear scurrying high up in the rafters. You look up. There are 7 of them, watching, not moving. The ratier says, "That's a council." You ask if they're dangerous. He tilts his head. "Only if they let you see them." Historical fact urban folklore from 14th century Paris records instances where people believed rats acted as omens, not just pests. Councils of rats seen gathered in unusually large, quiet groups were viewed as warnings of disease, failed crops, or structural collapse. In some cases, records note that buildings were abandoned or burned after sightings of so-called rat courts. Rat catchers were occasionally summoned not to remove the animals, but to interpret their behavior like augurs reading bird flight in Rome. This wasn't science, but it wasn't dismissed either. One account states, "The rats gathered thrice and stared without sound. On the 4th day, the bakery caved in. You and the ratier don't speak again for a while, not because there's nothing to say, but because silence feels safer than explanation." He leaves the charm tied to the rafters, a sprig of thyme, knotted with red twine. The rats don't run, but one blinks at you slowly. You blink back, not out of courtesy, just in case it matters. Cultural tidbit: in the low parts of the city, where the ground never truly dries, there was once a belief that rats could smell shame. They were said to gather near rooms where secrets were kept, where debts were buried, or where lovers spoke too loudly behind cracked doors. Some households left them gifts of garlic or cheese, not to drive them away, but to bribe their silence. The ratier once told you that rats don't forget where they're fed. He meant it as a warning, not advice. You step outside again, back into air that's colder than you remember. The charm on your belt jingles slightly. The ratier says nothing, but he walks beside you now, not ahead, just for a block, just until the lights return. Then he turns down a street that may or may not exist tomorrow and leaves you there, with flour on your boots and silence in your pocket. You sleep past dawn, and no one seems to mind. The innkeeper doesn't knock, the hallway candle burns halfway down, wax pooled like a spilled thought. Outside, Paris breathes slowly beneath a blanket of ash-coloured sky, the kind of weather that forgets how to be either warm or cold. The air is neither friendly nor unfriendly, it just is. You rise, stretch, and find that someone's left a strip of stale bread wrapped in cloth beside your door. It smells faintly of rosemary and smoke. The cloth is tied with red string. You don't need to guess who left it. You step outside. The street is unusually empty, not in the way of a holiday or a curfew, but in the way of a place that has recently hosted something it didn't want. A broom leans against a wall. A bucket rests beside a doorstep, still full. A black feather sits square in the middle of the road, like a mark on a clean page. The chalk spiral from yesterday is still there. No new dots, just the symbol, its edges soft from morning dew. You hear footsteps behind you, leather soles on stone, deliberate but slow. The ratier appears from the alley to your left, eating an apple that looks like it was found rather than bought. He gestures without speaking and walks. So you follow again. The route he takes is unfamiliar, and that's saying something in a city of streets that never seem to lead where they did yesterday. These buildings are narrower, older, they don't lean. They fold, the shutters are the wrong size for the windows. One building has a door on the second floor and no stairs to reach it. Someone's painted a rat in white on the wall there. No words, just the shape, stylized. Watching, the ratier stops at a small garden behind a butcher's shop. The fence is low, but the gate is heavy iron, as if the flowers are dangerous. He doesn't open it. He just stands beside it and looks out over the patch of soil. Nothing grows here anymore. Not really. The herbs are dry. The stones are warm from sun, but something's off. Then you see it, a single rat sitting near the center. It isn't moving. It isn't cleaning itself, or eating, or hiding. It's just sitting. Watching, the ratier squints. Chews the last of his apple. That one, he says, is what we used to call a perfect rat. You wait for the explanation. He offers none. Instead, he sits down beside the gate and starts sharpening a stick. Not his usual one. A new one. Pale wood, freshly stripped. You ask him what makes a rat perfect. He shrugs. Sits still. That's it. Moves only when it chooses. That feels ominous. Gets fed by people who swear they hate it. He checks the point of the stick and adds. And never runs. You nod like you understand, but you don't. Not really. You sit on the other side of the gate, knees pulled up, watching the rat. It doesn't blink. It doesn't twitch. It doesn't look hungry. You ask if he's going to catch it. The ratier laughs. Not a cruel laugh, just tired. Not that one, he says. That one's older than most houses. You ask how he knows. I've seen it before. So did the man who trained me. You ask what happened to him. The ratier doesn't answer for a long time. Then, he stopped showing up. You imagine being trained to chase things that never run. You wonder what it does to someone. You wonder if it's already doing it to you. Historical fact: by the late 14th century, many rat catchers had apprenticeships, and in some quarters of Paris, the position became semi-hereditary. Fathers passed roots down to sons, who inherited not just territory, but the maps, chalk codes, and even nicknamed rats. Guild records from 1384 mention a rat known as La Barbe, the beard, who had evaded capture for over a decade and was considered a guild trial. It became a rite of passage to encounter and fail to catch La Barbe. Catchers marked sightings in ledgers, often noting the rat's posture, feeding pattern, and presence of council behavior. Groups that watched in silence. The records weren't official science, but they were treated with the same weight. In one surviving fragment, a ratier writes, "Saw her again today, tail curled right. Looked through me. I offered garlic, she turned away. I left the street alone. Back in the garden, the perfect rat finally moves, not far, just enough to place itself in deeper shadow. It still doesn't run." The ratier places a tiny cube of stale bread on the soil, not near it, but between it and you. Test, he says. Of what? Of who's in charge. You want to laugh, but it doesn't feel right. The rat ignores the bread. But after 5 long minutes, it turns just slightly, and you know it's decided something. Then it's gone. Not scurried. Just gone. The space it left behind feels more occupied than empty. The ratier brushes soil from his boot. That one won't be back today, he says. You ask if that's good. Depends who you are, he replies. You walk with him again. The sky is darkening, not from sunset, but from clouds that have stopped pretending they're just passing through. Rain begins in polite taps, then commits. You both take shelter under a stone archway, cracked mortar, painted over symbols. One you recognize, the spiral with a single dot, not his mark. Someone else's. He doesn't seem surprised. You ask how many others do what he does. He shrugs. Used to be more. You ask what happened. He picks a piece of bark out of his cloak. Some caught rats. Some caught attention. You let the silence grow. It's a good silence, the kind you don't need to end. It listens to you, which in this city is rare. Cultural tidbit: in some parts of medieval Paris, it was believed that the rat who walks the same path thrice owns the house. This saying wasn't literal, but it guided behavior. If a rat was seen crossing the same street 3 days in a row, especially at the same time, it was thought to indicate unfinished business, unspoken curses, or unpaid debts. Superstitious residents often lit candles or scattered crushed lavender along the rat's path as a way of severing its hold. In some bakeries, owners threw out entire sacks of flour if a rat crossed them more than once in view of a child. The ratier tells you this without sarcasm. He says flour keeps memory, same as salt, same as walls. Then he changes the subject, but you can still feel the truth lingering on your tongue, like steam. You arrive back at the inn in near darkness. A cat waits at the doorstep. Not your cat. Not anyone's cat. But here tonight. It looks at you like it's waiting for a password. You nod. The cat blinks, then wanders off. Inside, the innkeeper offers no food, but she points to a basket beside the hearth. Inside, a piece of cheese, a square of waxed cloth, a small wooden token with the spiral. You take it, not because it's yours, but because someone knew you would. In your room, you sit by the window for a long time. Rain taps the glass in irregular patterns. Somewhere far below, a whistle echoes. 3 short notes, 2 long, then silence. You imagine a perfect rat watching, not afraid, not running, just watching, and you wonder if someday someone will name a tale after you. Sleep doesn't come easily that night, but it comes. When it does, it comes like a quiet knock on wood, not stone, familiar, not urgent. You wake just before dawn, not sure if the sound was part of your dream or the city checking in to see if you're still here. You sit up slowly. Your knees ache from yesterday's walking, and your cloak still smells like old bread and thyme. You consider changing. You don't. Outside, the sky is the color of tin. You'd call it morning if the light weren't so reluctant. At your door, a slip of parchment. Folded once, no wax seal. Just a spiral drawn in grey ink. This one has 2 dots inside the curve. New, you've never seen that before. You step into the street, and there he is, waiting, standing beside the same fountain where he once pulled a walnut from his boot. He doesn't speak, he just starts walking. So do you. Today, the city feels off. Not wrong, not dangerous. Just distracted. Like it's looking elsewhere. The bakers are out later than usual. The taverns haven't opened yet. And the pigeons are quiet, clustered near drain pipes like they're waiting for a signal. The ratier turns left, then right again, doubling back on streets that twist and fold like badly told stories. Eventually, you arrive at a building you're not sure you've seen before. Not a house, not a shop, something else. The door is tall, iron-bound, painted once, maybe black, but it's mostly just flaking wood now. A faded carving above the lintel reads, "In silence truth is counted." He knocks twice. The door opens on its own. You step inside. The room is long and low-ceilinged, walls lined with stone and rope and silence. Candles glow behind thick glass domes, and beneath them, jars. Dozens of jars. Each one contains something different. Teeth, bones, dried roots, tiny leather pouches, scraps of parchment, fur, and in some cases, what looks unmistakably like rat tails, coiled and preserved in vinegar. The ratier removes his cloak and hangs it on a brass hook. You do the same, without being told. There's another man already in the room. Older, grey-bearded, wearing gloves. He nods at the ratier, then at you, then says, "This one's yours?" The ratier replies, "Only for now." You aren't sure whether to feel flattered or nervous, maybe both. The older man walks to the far table, lights a second candle with a stick of charcoal, and unrolls a scroll. It's covered in symbols, not writing, at least not the kind you've ever seen. Swirls, arrows, circles with notches, X's with tiny feet drawn underneath. One mark looks exactly like a fish, another like an ear. He gestures to one in particular, a spiral with 2 dots. This one means watcher. He points to another, the same spiral, but upside down. This one means listener. You ask if there's a difference. He says, "You only need to be afraid of one." He doesn't say which. The ratier takes a piece of chalk and adds a new symbol, spiral, 2 dots, and a faint slash through the center. He looks at you. That's yours now. You don't know what that means. You're not sure you want to. Historical fact, some rat-catching guilds in medieval Europe developed private symbols to track behavior and locations, not unlike cartographers' marks. In Paris, certain spirals, arrows, and dots appeared regularly in butchers' quarters, bakeries, and wine cellars. Most residents didn't understand them. Some thought they were secret codes left by thieves or monks. Others believed they were blessings. In truth, they were often nothing more than personal shorthand, ways to remember what rats did where. Still, guild records from 1391 mention the listener's spiral, a mark feared enough that when found chalked near the Notre Dame bakery, the entire structure was fumigated and blessed for 3 days. The mark was never seen again, but it was never explained either. The older man finishes his tea, if that's what it is, and places the cup back on its stand without a sound. Then he says, "Tell him about the knock." The ratier looks at you, then away, then begins, "It was a wine cellar, near St. Paul. Just after a flood, I'd marked it clean, chalk on both beams, no movement for a week." You listen, but then the wine started going, casks cracked, one burst from the inside. He pauses, "So I sat, 3 nights. On the 3rd, I heard it." You ask what? He says, "A knock, not a sound. A knock, twice, measured, precise. I thought someone was above. No, it came from the cask, and I knocked back." He doesn't smile, doesn't flinch, just says something left, not quickly, not scared, just politely. You ask what it was. He shrugs. "Saw the spiral the next day." "Which one?" He doesn't answer, but you already know. Cultural tidbit: in some corners of medieval Paris, cellars were not used at night, not because of rats, but because of borrowers. These weren't thieves in the usual sense, but believed to be rat spirits or the long ones, who borrowed warmth, bread and wine when no one was watching. To keep the peace, people left scraps, crusts, bits of wax, dried fruit, not as offerings, as treaties. The rat catchers called it le calme, the quieting. It wasn't about superstition, it was about balance. If the rats knocked, and you knocked back, you were considered part of the rhythm. If you ignored it, sometimes the wine turned, sometimes the cats left, sometimes no one said your name for a week. You leave the chamber before noon, but it feels later. Time bends in rooms like that. Silence stretches it, thickens it, makes it feel like you've been listening for days. The ratier walks beside you, but not quickly. His step is slower today, weighted. You ask if he's tired. He says, "Always." You ask why he keeps going. He looks at you, half smiles, then says, "Because the spiral hasn't stopped showing up." Then adds, "And someone has to answer." The city doesn't feel bigger now, but it does feel deeper, like a cellar you didn't know had stairs. You step lightly, and listen. The afternoon is soft, grey, and hesitant, like a candle that doesn't want to be lit. You and the ratier return to the upper quarter by way of the Rue du Bouchers, the street of butchers. There's meat hanging in some of the stalls. Not fresh, not old, just there. Part of the scenery like bread crust in gutters and cats on rooftops. The wind has shifted. It now smells of wet stone and something faintly sweet. You ask if that's a good sign. He says, "It depends what dies today." Then he says nothing else for several blocks. At a small square, he stops. It's just past the old soap maker's shop, the one with the door that never opens and the candle that never goes out. The ratier kneels and begins drawing a chalk symbol on the side of the stone fountain. Not the spiral. Something else. A shape that looks like a double key. You watch. When he's done, he tosses the chalk aside. Not out of anger, out of ritual. You notice the piece lands directly inside a crack in the pavement. Upright, he doesn't notice, or pretends not to. He walks to a nearby stoop and sits. You do the same. No one else is here. Not really. You see figures pass through the far side of the square, blurred by drizzle and distance. No one comes near. He pulls a cloth bundle from his coat. Inside salted nuts, a wedge of apple, and a thin strip of meat that may or may not be beef. He eats slowly. You ask if today's different. He nods. You ask why. Because they've stopped watching. That doesn't sound like a relief, he explains. You spend enough time in this work, you learn to listen in two ways, for the rats and for who's watching the rats. You nod, unsure if that's metaphor or not. When they're watching, it means they want to be seen. When they're not, it means they already know you're there. You ask who they are. He chews, swallows, shrugs, doesn't matter. They're older than the city. They just use the rats to leave notes. You glance around, you feel no eyes. But maybe that's the point. He folds up the cloth and sets it beside the fountain. Not to litter, to leave, a gift or a message. He walks again. You follow. You don't ask where. You just count your steps and listen for echo. There isn't any. Historical fact, certain neighborhoods in 14th century Paris were marked on old ratier guild maps as quiet quarters. Not because they lacked rats, but because the rats there behaved differently. Records mention things like no squeaks but teeth marks, too still, left bait uneaten for 7 days. In these places, rat catchers were told to observe, not act. Some believed the rats were already bound by older treaties. An intervention might upset a balance. A surviving note from a 1397 guild journal reads, Rue de la Rue burned salt unnecessary. Silence present, leave cheese only. No chalk. The guild refused to clarify the entry, even under inquiry. Some historians believe these notations reference subterranean rodent colonies with unusual behavior. Others say they reflect guild superstition, protected rats in neighborhoods too politically or spiritually sensitive to disturb. No two scholars agree, but the maps exist, and the symbols match. As you turn onto a new street, you feel it immediately. The change. The walls here are closer together. The windows are shuttered from the inside. No carts, no children, no birds. You ask if this is a quiet quarter. The ratier nods, then says, "We don't stay here long." You see no rats, which feels wrong. You hear nothing, which feels worse. He drops a single clove of garlic into the center of the road. You ask why. He says, "Because the ones who smell it won't come out while we're here." You ask who. He doesn't answer. You pass a shop with no name, just a symbol carved in the wood, one you don't recognize. A circle within a triangle within a square. It makes your teeth hurt to look at it. The ratier doesn't stop, just walks a little faster. You follow. You do not look back. Eventually the air shifts again. The pressure lifts. You smell bread, smoke, someone laughing. Life. Again. You breathe more deeply. So does he. He stops by a drain pipe and kneels. Not to mark anything, but to listen. He tilts his head, then says, "They're back." You ask who. He says, "The ones who knock." You wait. You hear nothing. Then faintly, Just faintly, you hear knock, knock, then silence. He doesn't smile, but he nods. That's a greeting. Cultural tidbit in some medieval guild folklore. It was believed that certain rats remembered specific people, particularly those who fed or failed them. These were called knowers. They were said to recognize footsteps, smells, even emotional states. Catchers marked their paths in wax, not chalk, because wax could hold scent longer. There are even records of rats returning to the same doorstep after their nest was burned, sometimes years later, leaving teeth marks in the same corner of the same basket, as if reclaiming a debt. The catchers didn't kill knowers. They left them bread and a note, sometimes in chalk, sometimes in bloodroot, sometimes in silence. You return to the inn together. He doesn't speak much now, but as he opens the door, he pauses, then looks back, then says, "Don't chase the perfect ones. They let you follow only so you don't see where they're really going." You don't reply. You don't need to. The city speaks its own language, and you've started learning how to listen. It rains that night. Not a storm, just a long whispering rain that taps on shutters and drips steadily from eaves like it's counting time in reverse. You listen to it from your room, from your blanket, from a place halfway between waking and not. You do not sleep exactly, but you rest, and sometimes that's the better gift. When morning arrives, it does so gently. The light is soft, like warm cloth. You hear no bells, no wheels, no footsteps, only a faint scratch against the inn's back wall. You already know who's here. Downstairs, the fire is out. The bread basket is empty, but someone has left a coin on the hearthstone, round, unmarked, dull gold, though not from any mint you know. The innkeeper sees you looking. "Yours?" she asks. You shake your head. She doesn't question it. She just sweeps around it, leaves it where it lies. Outside, the spiral is gone. No chalk, no trace, not even a smear from rain. You step into the street. Everything looks the same, but feels like it's already forgetting you. You walk anyway. You find him where you began, near the Rue Saint-Antoine, where the mule pulled the turnip cart and the cat blinked like a judge. He's sitting on a barrel this time, arms crossed, sack beside him. You ask if today is busy. He says, "No more than usual." Then he says, "You remember where the quiet places are now?" You nod. He says, "Good." Then he stands, stretches, and walks. He does not look back. You do not follow. You understand. Now, you wander the city one last time. No chalk in your pocket, no charm at your belt. But your eyes move differently now. Your ears know how to listen sideways. You smell the difference between fear and ritual. You hear the shift in silence when something chooses not to run. You understand that bread left out is not always a meal, that a knot of rosemary can be a warning, that sometimes the spiral on your door is a kindness, and sometimes it's a request. You understand that the people who notice the smallest things are often the ones who carry the heaviest knowledge, that listening is its own profession. its own protection, its own quiet form of reverence. Final historical fact. In the centuries that followed, the guilds of rat catchers faded from civic record, but their symbols lingered in odd places. Notarial margins, cellar door lintels, and old family crests bearing faint spirals. By the 1500s, Paris had developed newer systems for urban pest control, but some households still requested a chalk man before major feasts or weddings. These were not licensed professionals, just quiet men with sharp ears, good boots, and too much time spent in basements. They left no contracts, only symbols, and the food somehow stayed fresher when they came. Final cultural curiosity. In some folklore retellings, the ratier does not die. He simply stops appearing, but his mark is left behind when needed. On an alley wall, on the corner of a stair, on a window just after the fog lifts. And in every story, someone new appears, not with a name, but with quiet eyes and a listening walk, carrying salt and bread and a sack that rustles softly in the dark. Final wind down, fade into quiet now. As you lie back, eyes soft, breath slower than before, you may notice how the world sounds quieter than it did 2 hours ago. There are still sounds, distant footsteps, a creaking pipe, the gentle breath of the room around you, but they don't ask for anything. They just exist, like the city, like the rat that watches but does not run, like the chalk that draws a spiral with a dot, then fades in the rain before dawn. You may not remember everything you heard tonight, but you'll remember how it felt, that deep folktale stillness, that soft weight of knowledge passed from hand to hand without words, that sense of being watched kindly by something older than your name. So breathe in, once, slowly, breathe out, let the spiral fade, and drift into soft cobbled dreams